Thank you. I feel like, how many of you have seen me present before? I feel like in many ways we are the same group that converted. You know, part of the challenge is not to be trite. Because we know this data. We've known this data. It was great to see Brian and what was presented. I was on the technical advisory group that went with all the nuances of the numbers and what we're looking at and not. And, you know, as I reflected, listening to what he put together, is it compelling? Is it not? And I will get to the re-envisioning policy priorities. But, you know, I just had to reflect. We've known this for 20-odd years. And getting from what we know to what we have to do is where we live in this policy space. And policy is about scale. So it's great to hear the individual student stories and the successes, and we all have them. But, you know, policy, you know, the perfect is the enemy of the good enough when we deal with policy. And that speaks to the challenge and how we deal with this. So I wanted to see if I could posit 3 things that hopefully are not trite. If so, then maybe Michelle will get us out of that space. We'll tag team it here. But I guess I'd like to suggest to you as we look to re-envisioning policy priorities that it's less about diversity and it's more about inclusivity. And, you know, a lot of the policy work, it's the policy speak, it's are we being trite, is it, you know, I will say we know that there's baggage of saying diversity because it seems like we're being divisive and we're excluding others. It was never intended to be that way. But in policy, you have to create space to work. And when terms get loaded, that you then, you know, you're stopped before you even get a chance to talk about it. Framing the issue so you can act on the data and what we know is probably our biggest policy priority when we think about this work. Because we've done these data, we know this work, we know the current position. Those gaps have not changed in 30 years and probably more. And, you know, I sometimes, I am a data nerd and I celebrate that and that's a wonderful thing. But data are only as good as they're used to act, to do something. And I think that's the space that's been more challenging for us. I sat in my list, and we do a lot of work trying to find evidence-based practices, what's working. We talk about scaling those things up. You all know that. You talk about that. And yet what we haven't seen is that acceleration to close gaps. And I wonder, you know, when we talk about serving all, if that's good enough, because if we were actually truly serving all, would we still have these kinds of gaps? And I think we have to be honest in our discussion saying, you know, in trying to serve all, are we addressing equality or equity? And what the heck does that mean in a policy environment? It sounds trite, I think, unless we have concrete ways of dealing with it. But I do think that framing the issue so that we can act in our respective states means that we don't necessarily have one message or approach, but it's absolutely critical in our state context that we find a way to do it. Because otherwise we're in this dark room after having these, I find sexy charts, but most people don't find them all that sexy, talking about issues that, you know, people don't like to talk about race and ethnicity. It's just uncomfortable. And we create this environment of a them versus us that, I don't know if you face in policy, but we face that all the time. We're talking about those people. And for policy to work, they can't be a them, they have to be us. And I mean, the people in this room see, you know, to be brown or to be on the graph that is growing is not an other group, it is us. But I would posit that from a policy perspective, it's often positioned that it's them and it's us. And then we don't have to invest or, you know, those people have an issue in a crisis. And that's not constructive in policy because we have to address scale, and that means all of our community. And these are a part of that community. I spend a lot of time doing ignorance abatement, which is what I call it, you know. And I say that all the time because ignorance is not knowing. Stupidity, you can't do much about, but ignorance you can. And so the second thing I want to say is that, you know, as we think about policy, and again, being very pragmatic, I think we need to spend a little less time trying to convince people that this is important and spend our time and energy working with the people that are ready to do the work. Because there are a lot of them out there, And if we spend all of our time trying to convince people, oh, diversity, inclusivity is important, here are the numbers, isn't that enough to make you want to act? Well, you know, we've been through so many of those, and the people that are ready to act are, you know, we're not getting together and saying, okay, I'm done talking about it, let's do it. And if it's just one or two of you, órale, let's go. Let's do it. Let's find a way and step by step grow it. Because I do find people want to bank and invest in a solid success, right? You know, when they see it's working, then they want to jump on board. If they're not quite sure and they don't know what it means for them, they're less likely. But there are a lot of really good people working on the ground, doing it every day, and partnering with them gets you the kind of traction you don't get if you're always trying to convince those that need to be convinced that this matters. And we've seen that happen in policy. You guys see it in lots of issues. And I think we're seeing that in trends with adult learners and remediation that we didn't see 10 years ago. And working with the willing, sounds trite again, but it's such a different approach than we often take in this space. So that would be the second thing I would say, and trying to re-envision our policy priorities overall. I do think that the third part is this term, and maybe I am doing a lot more framing, I guess, but that's okay. Michelle, you can do with the other part of it. You know, being intentionally inclusive is probably, when we talk about policy priorities, our biggest challenge, because if the idea is everything costs more, in policy I often hear, yeah, we want to serve Latinos. We need more money to do that. Well, you know, I'm not here to say that money doesn't matter. I do believe it matters. But if you have to wait for new money to do it, to serve the community that's already there, then we have a lot of policy issues that we need to address that have nothing to do with money. They really have to do with how we see the community in our states that we fundamentally need to serve, and that undergird our economic and our social well-being. And there isn't enough money to deal with that if I have to spend all my time convincing you that you need to do that. And I think that takes us from a discussion of not just convincing and framing, but finding ways to be intentionally inclusive means we know the kinds of things that are working. Do we know if these young people and these adults that we are talking about in data are a part of it? I find amazing programs working in institutions across the country, serving 25, 35 students, some of them that have been scaled up to serve 1,000 students and such. But when I ask them, and do you know if it's working for your students of color, your first generation students, your low-income students? Well, I mean, we offer it. We know that the students who are participating are doing a good job. Do you know if it's serving Latinos? Also, just as a way to get it started, it could be males, it could be African American. Do you know if it's serving that group? Because you can have the best program in a state and not be serving those who could probably benefit the most. And if we don't take responsibility for that, then it's a program that's still serving 1,000 people well, but maybe not those that you were hoping to target. And that's kind of a level of pragmatism that we all have as policy analysts and as policymakers that is hard to bring forward. Because we want to focus on the success of the 1,000, because we need to promulgate that, we need to get that money for those serving those 1,000 again, without focusing on the really hard issue, and this is the other one that I'll quickly say, and then I have one more. But we have to acknowledge that to serve these low-income first-generation students of color, those that you see our projections up there, is going to cost us more for some of the reasons that Brian articulated and that we know. And we have to be comfortable with that short-term investment for long-term gain. I think we don't talk about that anymore in public policy when we are trying to re-envision our policy priorities. And that removal, that stepping back from policy, from public policy priorities to say we need to be efficient, and maybe to the detriment of effectiveness, efficiency and effectiveness. You know, my background's in economics, and that's probably things that keep me up at night. We have to be more efficient. I don't think there's any question of that. We have to be more accountable. We have to, but can we re-envision things that are efficient and accountable, that provide access to quality for a broader group? That is a heck of a challenge, and I promised myself I wasn't going to curse up here. When Brian asked me to speak about knocking at college door, I slipped one out, and it was the one thing that Inside Higher had quoted. I was like, darn it! But it does get to a really, I mean, a point where you get impassioned and thinking about how do we make this work? And sometimes you take off the idealism and you say, let's be pragmatic about it. What can I get done from a policy perspective that puts me on a path that's probably longer term, but that gets me a quick win? And I do think that that is, when we re-envision what's possible, all these conversations about reinvention, innovation, create new opportunities if we include this group in what we're talking about. It's great if it works. Does it work for these groups, whatever the groups are where you're focusing on? If it's adults, is it including our adult learners, our returning students? If it's Latinos, is it including them? And how do we know? And if it is, that should be celebrated. We should talk about it and move on in policy. We don't have to keep focusing on it if it's working. But if you can't prove that it's working in meaningful ways or know that they're included and have that opportunity, I think it's disingenuous to step back. And we have to hold ourselves accountable for that. And that's a part that how do you create accountability for that? So maybe I'm just positing more questions and answers. But I do think vision is more than just the data. Re-envisioning is more than just the suggestion of what is possible. It's not the convincing of things that are probable, which is where we all love to be. I love all that kind of stuff. I really do. But the pragmatism that's involved to get us where we need to get, that becomes the real big challenge. The last thing I'll say, and hopefully I'm within my time frame, and I have lots of examples, but I wasn't going there because you guys know these examples too. You kind of know what works. So I would just pause you to think about, are they working for the populations that Brian talked about and that these students represented, is a question we should really be frank about and not be afraid to raise it, because I think talking about race and ethnicity describes us, doesn't have to divide us unless we let that happen. And too often we let it happen and we don't want to talk about it. But the last thing I'll say is that, we have this strategy in public policy. We have a decision to make. Do we take the bull by the horns, to use that kind of all-American expression, or are we kind of what I call passive-aggressive about it? And the taking the bull by the horns and saying, we're not going to apologize for the fact that we see these gaps, we want to address it. We can do it in a manner that is inclusive intentionally and doesn't exclude others, but that we have limited resources, public resources. And amongst those things, this is what we're going to do. Unless we can find ways to do that that are authentic to our individual states and our organizations, we're just going to keep seeing these gaps. And in 10 years, we're going to have a very good report by Brian and Witchy and others. And, I'm complicit. I have to admit that. At Excelencia in Education, we love data. We put it out there. But we are working in small ways with communities because we know it has to be more than that. And we're hoping that we can get those converted who are working at a scale where it affects policy in more meaningful ways. But I do think the choice is, do we take the bull by the horns? Are we passive-aggressive and say demography is destiny, it's inevitable, so let's just wait it out and let them figure it out, and we'll just be here and we'll be good stewards of the broad scale? That is our challenge in re-envisioning and setting up priorities that really matter for our states, for our economy and our citizenry, and our overall country. And, I don't mind comparing to other countries, but, we are egocentric enough as a country that, well, that's Belgium and that's Norway. Well, they're heterogeneous. We have all reasons that we can excuse that we don't compare them. But what we have here is an opportunity to do more and be at the forefront. I think as policymakers, we have to take that opportunity seriously, or we need to not be doing this kind of work. And I think that level of pragmatism and awareness takes us beyond this powerful analysis and the awareness we're creating to a point of action. And when we get to that point, we have a lot of good examples of what could be done at a small enough scale. Is it good enough for state policy? Are we going to see that? I'm not sure. And I think we have to be honest about that too. And too often, you get pitched, this is the answer. Do this thing. So I'm not going to tell you that because I don't think that you guys would believe me anyways. And I'm not sure that I even have the answer, but I do think that is the enterprise that we fundamentally have to be about. so that, 10 years from now, we're not still citing more and more demographics and stats and thinking that it'll resolve ourselves because we're now more educated about what our polis looks like.
Thank you, Deborah.
Michelle?
All right. I actually like to stand up when I'm talking, so I'm going to stand up. We'll see how this works out. So good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. I'm really happy that I've been invited here. Thanks you, SHEEO. Deborah and I work a few blocks away from each other. We live a couple miles away from each other, and I only see her out of town.
That's true.
So it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with her, and I appreciate how she has offered the framing of what we're here to talk about this morning. And I appreciate Aaron's introductory remarks as well. Both of them are right. This is something we've been talking about for a long time. And I really am grateful to the staff at SHEEO for putting it on the agenda. So yesterday we spent the day talking about how do we embark on the road to Goal 2025, where are we sort of in that process, so getting a status update and thinking beyond sort of where it is we need to go. And I really appreciated that conversation, and I appreciate the fact that today you've made it very explicit as a part of your agenda that you want to talk about demographics, because if nothing else, that tells me that the folks at SHEEO really understand that you can't get to the road to 2025 without being aware of the demographic realities. And if nothing more that you forget anything else I say, just remember that you cannot get to the road 2025 without being aware of the demographic realities and doing something intentional about it. And the question about gaps always comes up. I too, like Deborah, try not to be trite. I feel like I talk about these issues so often that I'm constantly trying not to bore myself in the conversation. I'm trying to think of ways to keep me engaged, because it gets a little frustrating that I'm not seeing the type of movement that I really, really desire to see. And one of the conversations, people always say, well, what do we do? How do we make this work? And I find that interesting because it's almost as if we have in the higher education community bought into the belief that addressing demographic realities is something that we cannot do. And just for a moment, I want to take you on a little history lesson to prove that we've done this before, okay? So think back to those of you who have studied higher education. Think back to the Rudolph book on the history of higher education. First institutions were created in the 17th and 18th centuries, and why were they created? Not who were they created for, but do you remember why they were created? Louder? Ministers. Clergy, to prepare the clergy. That was what we did in the 17th and 18th century. So before the American Revolution, we had about 10 institutions, serving about 1,000 students, and they all had explicit missions, except one of them, to serve the clergy. That was their mission statement. Many of these institutions are still around, and their mission statements have changed. Moving on to the 19th century. 19th century, let's think about who was not enrolled in higher education in the 19th century. Who wasn't there? Women. The latter half of the 19th century, we finally opened the doors to women, and now today, in 2013, we have more women in college than men in many institutions. We also then opened the doors to public institutions. And many will say that the creation of the Morrill Land-Grant Acts is actually one of the things that ushered into the first wave, the mass movement of demographic shifts and change in higher education. They say that the second thing that changed the face of higher education was the GI Bill. And then after the GI Bill, we then had the Civil Rights Act. And then the Higher Education Act. All of these things not only changed the face of our institutions, our colleges and universities, they also changed the face of American society. They ushered in this middle class. So when people start telling me we've never done this before, or we're not used to these students, these populations, they're so different, I'm overwhelmed, we've done this before. History has proven that. And Deborah mentioned the fact that this is something that we've been talking about for well over 20 years, maybe 30 years. Maybe some of you can remember even longer than that. I like the internet. I'm an internet junkie. I have all the little gadgets, and I like to play around with them all the time. And so in preparation for this, I decided to Google demographics in higher education. Can anyone guess how many results I found? You can't guess, because I was blown away. 130 million results in Google if you Google demographics in higher education. Brian, you actually showed up. Your reports, you're actually in the Google lineup of some of the reports that are there. Jackie King is in there, Cheryl Blanco's in there, Deborah, you're in there, like, you know, many of you, I'm sure, are in there. So this is definitely something we've been talking about for a while, so it's nothing new. But I think that if you really, really want to see some change, you have to, as Deborah said, be intentional about it. You have to be intentional about it. Now, intentionality for some of us will require a simple change in attitude, or maybe not so simple change, but it requires a change in attitude. For others, it will require a change in behavior. And for others, it's going to require a combination of both. You're going to need an attitude adjustment and a behavior modification plan. So you're going to need both. But if you really, really want to see the demographics in your state, the realities in your state lead into a policy environment that is favorable for change and particular outcomes, we are going to have to really address what it is we're seeing, and then we're going to be intentional, and we need to be intentional in our actions about it. And when I say intentional, we have to be very explicit about who it is we are serving and why it is we're serving them. I am certainly one of those people who believe that it's important to serve all students. I talk about that all the time. But I also recognize that if I'm not clear about why it is that I want to focus, or why it is that we at IHEP want to focus on the underserved community, then it is very easy to overlook those communities. It's very, very easy to do. It happens all the time. So for my portion of the comments, I actually want to build upon what Deborah's already offered, sort of as some general themes and ways of thinking about things, and I want to take it a step even further in terms of offering some practical advice about what it is you really, really can do. And to do that, I want to build off of something I heard yesterday. I learned a lot yesterday. I'm glad I actually was able to participate in the entire day. Julie, I actually went to all the sessions, from 8:30 in the morning all the way to 10 o'clock at night. That's very rare. So, but I want to talk about what I heard in the session that was done by the folks at SHEEO. So Dan and Tom and Bill, they talked about this report that I have sitting right here. I encourage you to get a copy. It's called Creating a New Compact Between States and Public Higher Education. And it just came out in June, right? And I just heard about it yesterday, and I have already read a significant proportion of it, so I'm going to encourage you all to do the same thing. But what I really want to focus on is this framework that they talk about on page 23 to 28, and it's around some 4 commitments that they want to offer the higher education community. Now, I want to give us a couple of disclaimers, a few disclaimers here. I'm using this framework. I changed my framework that I had actually come here to talk about. I changed it after hearing their framework, because I like their framework better. And the second thing is, in addition to liking their structure better, I also thought about you. I thought about the folks who I'd be talking to, and I want to give you suggestions, and I want to give you advice and some things that are going to have some real meaning to you, that are going to have some real applicability to you, something that you're going to be able to take back to your home office, your home institution, and do something with. And so, because this report's already out there, it's already out there. Hopefully you already have a copy. Hopefully you've already read it or will read it soon. There's no need for me to recreate the wheel. They already did a really good job of that. But the last and most important disclaimer is that the comments that I'm going to share about their framework and how I think you can apply it are my comments. If you don't like something I say, don't get on those guys' case. If you do like something I say, I'm sure they'll be happy to take some of the credit too. Okay. So the first commit, they have 4 commitments, but then for the sake of time, I only want to focus on 3. I want to focus on alignment, I want to focus on affordability, and I want to focus on accountability. Alignment, affordability, accountability, 3 A's. And give you a couple of examples. So let's look at the alignment of state needs. And as we all know, higher education advances a number of state needs. Primarily those that are linked to workforce development, job creation, economic growth, and things of that nature. We know this, and One of the session leaders that I heard yesterday said that when you're talking about these types of things, you have to be aware, when you're talking to legislators, you have to be aware of the political realities. So recognizing that your legislators are likely to be more comfortable talking about things like job growth, job creation, economic development, things like that, then let's start the conversation there. At least that won't get the door shut in your face, right? So if you start the conversation there, I truly believe that you have to talk about demographic realities in order to talk about growth in those particular areas. Looking at workforce issues primarily from an equity lens, just think about an equity lens, helps you to justify an explicit, targeted focus on underserved communities within a given state. I'm fairly confident, actually I'm very confident, that in most states, if you are going to move the needle on the attainment goals that we talked about yesterday, if you're going to make any significant change in those numbers for your state, you're going to have to focus on the underserved community in your state. It's impossible to think that you can do that without an explicit focus on those communities. Now, what I also recognize is that in every state, the underserved community looks differently. So the most important question for you as state leaders is to know who it is that you need to serve. So who is your underserved community? Who is it that you should be targeting, and really focus in on them? So if you are, say, in West Virginia, like Rob and Angie, I'm not sure if this is true, Rob and Angie, but maybe the underserved community in your state might warrant a focus on income. Maybe if you are, say, in a place like Washington State, over in the far west, your underserved community might warrant some attention on issues like race and income, and it might lead you to decide that the low-income Asian population is where you want to focus your attention. Maybe you are in some place like Minnesota, like Nancy, and you may say your underserved community is actually the refugee community. It looks different everywhere is my point. And you have to recognize that if you don't know who it is you need to serve in order to align your state goals towards completion, attainment, workforce development, then you actually don't really know what you're doing. Sorry. Okay? Okay. So the next thing, the second commitment looks at affordability. So let's always talk about affordability. It's a top priority, top concern for just about everyone. Students this morning talked about some of their realities and realities of those that they know when it comes to affordability. And if you look at the ASKU framework that's in this report, they actually give some ideas about how to address things around affordability. And Excelencia, IHEP, a number of organizations, we have all received funding from the Gates Foundation to look at the issue of affordability. So there are lots of proposals and ideas that are swirling right now in this area. But I want to just focus on one small issue that I want to look at from an equity lens, because that's the lens I'm looking at, and recognize that we have to think about the low income and the students of color if we're thinking about affordability in the context of creating economic development. We have to recognize that they have to be a part of the conversation, and that in doing so and recognizing that, we have to also acknowledge that if college is beyond their financial reach, then we actually are not doing a very good service to them, nor are we aligning our goals to our state. So in some states, we'll find that there is this trend towards using more dollars, for example, towards merit aid, as Brian showed us, than towards need-based aid. Now, if that's what you want to do in your state, that's your prerogative. But I'm just here to tell you that if you care about workforce development, job creation, and you're thinking about the population that you are trying to serve in that state, if you have a policy that is taking money away from your neediest population, the population that actually needs these funds to go to school, and providing it to a population that would already have some funds to go to school, just recognize that what you have done is reinforce an inequitable higher education system. Just recognize that, because that kind of policy, that kind of movement is actually not going to move the needle much in terms of getting you to where you need to go on that road to goal 2025. The last thing I want to touch on, Deborah touched on this already, is accountability. And the accountability movement is certainly nothing new to those of you who are higher education veterans and have been working on this stuff for many, many years. But what you all probably have noticed, or what we all have noticed, is that there are now many more voices that have been added to that chorus. And the chorus is getting louder and louder and much more demanding. And one of the things that I think that we have to do as we are in this sort of movement around accountability is that we have to recognize that we need a greater reliance and dependency on good data, good data. Now, I know that there's a lot happening in the states around data and the use of data, and I think that's all great. And I think that there's also a lot of discussions and intentionality around making sure that you disaggregate your data. I think that's great. But what I have learned in meeting with a lot of people from the institutions and state, many are disaggregating their data. But many of them aren't using the disaggregated data to do anything with. So that makes me wonder, like, okay, if you now have the data and you're not using it, then maybe it's worse to not have it if you're not going to do something with it once you have it. Make sense? So I really want to say that, you know, if we want good outcomes, then we have to use disaggregated data, and we have to use it to better understand the target population. And that population, as I mentioned, varies from state to state. And once you better understand that target population, you can then determine what are the appropriate interventions and support systems that need to be available for those students. Deborah also shared, we got these little anecdotes and stories, but nothing that's really rippling up to the level of scale. And I have tons of those. And one that I like to talk about when I talk about disaggregated data is University of Texas, El Paso. So we've worked with them, and they use data to measure their 4-year graduation rate, their 6-year graduation rate, but they also developed some metrics to look at interim progress and progression for their at-risk population within their institution. They then took that information and created what they call this risk stratification model. And in that model, they're able to identify the factors that are impeding progress for these particular students as they progress toward their degree. And then they took that information and worked with their academic affairs and their student affairs teams to really create appropriate supports and interventions. That's one institution, but it doesn't seem that hard to be able to do that at more institutions and on a broader scale. So the other thing I want to touch on is student learning outcomes. One thing in my bio that I think a lot of people sometimes forget, Deborah, is I used to work at AAC&U, so I am a disciple of AAC&U and their work around student learning outcomes. And I think it's important that as we talk about completion, as we talk about attainment, we need to make sure that we need to have degrees that are actually degrees of quality. And I'm worried that in our quest for more degrees, quicker, faster, in a hurry by 2025, that we are going to start compromising or overlooking on the issues of quality. And that's a very big part of this whole accountability movement. We need to be able to prove that we're actually giving students something that is of value. The one area that I think raises my eyebrows the most when I think about the completion agenda and quality and the convergence is around certificates and credentials. So we want to be able to count these, and I want to count them too, but I also want to make sure that for the students that they count the most. Like they're actually getting something that won't be just useful for one job, they'll be useful for multiple jobs, and that Deborah talks about sometimes the scaffolding, and she probably can talk about it a little bit more. But that's going to be really important. And yesterday, there was a lot of conversation around technology and online learning. I think technology is great. Like I said, I have lots of gadgets, and I love them all. I think technology certainly has the ability to be very transformative in terms of teaching and learning. I think it has the potential to open the doors of our institutions to many, many more students. But I want to encourage you to understand that technology in and of itself is not a success strategy. So if you are going to use technology, especially with the population in your state that is an underserved population, you need to make sure that, first of all, you understand the population, you understand what they need, and you target your technology use to a broader success agenda that is also coupled with some realistic outcomes for that population. So I'm going to stop there. Those are sort of 3 examples. Like I said, I pulled from the framework that SHEEO had already created because I just liked the framework. I thought it was good. And essentially what I'm trying to show you is frameworks exist out there. You know, this is nothing, you know, the frameworks are there. The ideas, the data points, they're there. But we have to put an equity lens on our work in order to figure out what it is that we need to do. And when you take these things that you're probably already working on and you look at it from an equity perspective, you think about it in terms of broader state goals, you think about it in terms of the target populations within your state, I think being intentional and inclusive, you really could probably see far more progress, but you have to do them both at the same time. That's it. Okay?